Welcome to this afternoon's program, Open the Gates, Jewish Stories from Our Congregation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bruce Black, and I was honored to be asked by Rabbi Glickman to chair the committee which selected the stories from our temple's website, Our Jewish Stories, that you're about to hear. Today is Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year. And like Jews all around the world, we are spending the day in prayer, both on screen and off, hoping the gates of heaven will open so that God can hear our prayers. In between prayers, we are sharing stories, as Jews do whether we join together in temple or find ourselves quarantined at home, whispering stories to each other after one prayer ends and before another begins, so that our stories become like prayers too. Stories like prayers use words to convey our hopes and dreams, our fears and doubts. Stories help us explore what we don't understand. They help us express what isn't always clear in our hearts. They give us a way of communicating with others. And sometimes, if the writer goes deep enough, they help us, both the storyteller and the person hearing the story, communicate with each other and, in the process, discover something larger than ourselves, connecting us all to a divine power, to what or who we Jews call God. The stories that you are about to hear were written by members of our congregation. Each story is, in its own way, a prayer that the writer has sent out into the world, hoping someone like you, and maybe even God, will hear. A prayer for friendship, a prayer for home, a prayer to remember, and a prayer to be remembered, a prayer for Israel, or a prayer for simply being able to be a Jew. If you listen closely enough, you can hear the prayers of each writer, and their prayers can carry each of our prayers with them to the gates of heaven, where we hope God will hear our words and grant us another year of life, another year of good health and love, and with luck, another year with many more stories. Thanks to each of these writers for sharing their stories with us. Thanks to Rabbi Glickman and Rabbi Shefrin and the High Holiday Committee for inviting us to share these stories. Special thanks to Charla Gold and Dr. Gary Jenko, the co-chairs of this committee, for their help selecting the stories from the temple's website, where you can read them again or find more wonderful stories from other members of our temple. How I wish we could have shared them all in today's program. Most of all, thanks to all of you for listening and for sharing the holiness of this day with us. Liz Klaber will be reading her story, Visiting Israel. Liz moved to Sarasota in 1986 with her husband, Neil. She's happily retired as an executive director of the Sarasota County Tax Collector's Office. Liz has served on several local boards and especially enjoyed her tenure on the Temple Emanuel board. Thanks, Liz, for sharing your story with us.
I visited Israel for the first time in the summer of 1971. I was 16 years old, and my parents and I did the classic first-time tour, visiting all of the major sites throughout Israel. This was long before Birthright, and I knew I was fortunate that we could do this trip. Before I go further, first some background. I grew up in Skokie, a suburb of Chicago. Skokie had a very large and visible Jewish presence. A significant number of Holocaust survivors were known to live there, and many believe that is why Skokie was picked by the neo-Nazis for the infamous march in 1978. But that's another story. Most of my friends were Jewish, and it was easy to be Jewish. The public schools all closed on the Jewish holidays, a fact very well appreciated by the non-Jewish students. During the year that I turned 13, I had at least one bar bat mitzvah every single weekend. We felt so sorry for our non-Jewish friend Cecil that we threw him a mock bar mitzvah, and he was actually able to speak the start of the most common Jewish prayers. Bottom line, I had a very comfortable Jewish childhood that included Hebrew school, JCC camp, and this trip to Israel. My parents, both first-generation Americans on at least one side, grew up in Chicago. But my mother's experience was very different from mine. She grew up in a part of Chicago where there were very few Jews. There were just a few Jewish kids in her elementary school, and she stood out as the nerdy, unfashionable, smart Jewish kid. She was clearly different from everyone else. This background is key to something that my mother said in Israel that has stayed with me all these years. After the first day or so of being there, my mom said something to the effect, "Can you believe everyone here is Jewish? Can you believe the prime minister, the judges, the mail carriers, the cooks? They're all Jewish." She was visibly choked up, and I responded in my snarky adolescent way, "What do you mean they're all Jewish? We're from Skokie, everyone's Jewish." While I knew that Israel was a Jewish state, my comment clearly conveyed that I was living in a cocoon with a very limited perspective of the world at large. Flash forward almost 50 years to the present. My husband Neil and I recently took a trip to Israel. Neil was volunteering on an IDF base as part of the Sorel program, and I had the luxury of staying in Israel on my own when he was on the base. This was my 5th or 6th trip to Israel. Neil and I happened to elope on visit number 2. And because I'd been here several times before, my focus was not to tour. Instead, I hoped to immerse myself in the daily rhythm of life in Israel, even if just for a few weeks. While I was in Israel, I remembered what my mother said. Of course we know that not everyone in Israel is Jewish, but her point to marvel and celebrate the Jewish state has stayed with me. As I think back on my own life, the importance of Israel to me has grown with each passing year. When I moved to Florida from Chicago in 1986, it was a culture shock on many levels, not least of which was my Jewishness. During my first week of employment at the tax collector's office, I encountered some hateful anti-Semitic Jewish comments from a customer who was disparaging Longboat Key. State conferences were routinely held on the high holidays. Opening prayers at government events were all typically made in the name of Jesus. I clearly wasn't in Chicago. On the current national front, incidents of anti-Semitism are rising here and abroad, and Israel is routinely a target. Israel isn't perfect, of course, but neither is America. Like so many American Jews, I believe Israel is our miracle, a source of pride and an absolute that must survive and thrive. As a grown woman, I clearly have learned that my country as a whole is very different from the safe little Jewish world in which I grew up. And Mom, I understand what you meant. You meant that Israel felt like home. My last trip to Israel was amazing. It felt like home.
Isaac Azarad will be reading his story, Leaving Egypt Behind. Isaac is the executive director of Temple Beth Israel on Longboat Key and past president of Temple Emanu-El. He is a past board member of the Jewish National Fund, a past director of communications at the Jewish Federation of Sarasota Manatee, and past president of Main Street Graphics. He lives in Sarasota. Thanks, Isaac, for sharing your story with us.
Sitting in our sun-drenched living room in that sun-drenched city aptly named Heliopolis, City of the Sun, on that morning, I'm stirred by the ominous feeling that I'm about to experience a defining moment in our family's history. I'm handing over a box to my newly appointed French language professor. In that box is my treasure, my stamp collection that I painstakingly assembled and cataloged for the best part of my 15 years. The teacher, Fauzi, is a pretentious, syrupy little man who was hastily implanted in our school to displace my esteemed professor who had just been expelled to his native France. Fauzi is totally inadequate as a francophone, mispronouncing common words so pedantically that I am developing an antipathy for his hypocritical man with his repeated expressions of feigned concern for my family's welfare. This man will rob me of my last personal possession, and along with it, he will leave our home that morning with books, paintings, blankets, pillows, and articles of clothing. This was open season on the departing Jews. In the corner of the living room, suitcases sat patiently on the prized Persian rug next to a shoulder-high wrought iron pedestal propping a fishbowl. A top-heavy aquarium that my sister Loretta and I had tipped over many times, sending our fish and our nanny into a frenzy in her attempt to save the fretting goldfish, gasping for air, while at the same time doing her best to hide the incident from our parents. Next to that pedestal was a matching round marble-top coffee table with a wrought iron base fashioned after the design of the genteel society of the time. That table, I recall, had the ideal height for my sister Sabrina's hesitant first steps as she propped herself up when she learned how to walk a few years earlier. This image of our familiar home, comfortable and semi-opulent, was to be relegated to distant memories in the years to come. The following morning, my family will gather the assembled suitcases lined up in our predictably sunny living room and head to the airport for a final voyage, leaving Egypt behind with no prospect of ever returning to our native land. With the clothes on our backs and our meager cash allowance of $20 per person, we were leaving without a definite plan of resettlement. In the second exodus from the land of Egypt, more than 80,000 souls embarked on a similar adventure, fraught with apprehension and excitement. A few months prior to that fateful morning in August of 1962, things started turning for the worst. My father's lucrative business was summarily confiscated, along with our assets, real estate, bank accounts. It started out gradually when a business guardian was appointed by the government to oversee the smooth transition of ownership to an Arab owner. No compensation was deemed necessary, as Jews were considered enemies of the state. The occasional shouts of Etbah el-Yahud, slaughter the Jews, were beginning to be heard more frequently and in more places. The toxic atmosphere was fomented by a revived sense of patriotism among the masses and ignited by Gamal Abdel Nasser, the pan-Arabism hero. Nasser nationalized businesses, confiscated wealth and belongings, and blamed the ills of the country on all foreigners, and particularly on the Jews. Our family had been in Egypt for 5 generations. One incident in early 1956 sealed our fate as the harbinger of our heightened sense of mounting insecurity. We felt violated when my father was taken at gunpoint in the middle of the night by 2 uniformed goons with automatic weapons who accused him of being a Zionist spy. The accusation and arrest followed when they noticed a press badge on the dashboard of my father's parked car. This was a car that my father, Maurice, shared with my uncle Jacques, who by virtue of being the editor of the 2 French newspapers, the Progrès Égyptien and La Bourse Égyptienne, was considered part of the press corps. Perhaps unrelated to that incident, my uncle Jacques was later replaced by a government guardian, an overseer of the press, who was none other than a former classmate of his, a young officer by the name of Anwar al-Sadat. The stories of hardship and disappointment will be repeated throughout the Middle East and North Africa for Jews from Arab countries, with their numbers swelling to close to 1 million displaced persons in the decades of the 50s and 60s. The personal stories of destitution and displacement of the Jews from Egypt pale in comparison to the horrors of World War II. The fate of our brothers and sisters who perished in the Holocaust is not to be compared to any event in the history of mankind. It is perhaps out of respect for their memories and for the suffering of the survivors that the plight of Jews from Arab lands had been kept silent. For more than 50 years, Jews from Egypt remained quiet, relegating their memories to the back pages of history. Only recently, some of our acquaintances and relatives started unraveling their family's saga in some details. Lucette Lanyaro, who expounded so articulately in her book, The Man in the White Sharkskin Suit, traced the journey of her family from Egypt to France to Israel and then to America. Coincidentally, along with my parents and two sisters, we have traveled an identical journey. I remember that my mother, Tony, of blessed memory, had identified so strongly with the characters in the book that she kept exclaiming how astonishingly familiar the stories were. A similar journey is depicted in Andre Asimon's book, Out of Egypt, portraying a rich history of cosmopolitan life and reminiscing about the traditions of multiculturalism in the golden age of Cairo and Alexandria. A few years ago, my first cousin Elliot Malki of Milan has produced a new documentary showing at the Jerusalem Film Festival, tracing the life journey of several Jews from Egypt and their rise to success and prominence across the globe. The story of Jews from Egypt is one of triumph in the face of adversity, a story that demonstrates to the world that freedom from bondage is a character trait embedded in our Jewish ethos. Despite the circumstances, the Jewish bond that binds us together makes us responsible for one another. I never heard the word refugee uttered from any of my fellow Jews from Egypt. We were simply travelers on a journey of hope, no longer Egyptian Jews, but simply Jews from Egypt. Along every step of the way, during every trial and every hardship, a Jew was there to lend a hand to my family. At every stage of my life, I found help and guidance, support and comfort from an individual Jew or Jewish organizations. I have a healthy respect for the awesome responsibility that I owe my people and the debt that I have to my heritage. To me, Judaism is a positive and necessary force in the world, and it needs to be nurtured and preserved by Jews, for all Jews, and for humanity at large. Our sages tell us that the task of repairing the world is incomplete, but it is ours to undertake. I believe them.
Leo Glickman will be reading his story, Why Are You Jewish? Leo is a graduate of Sarasota High School and is now studying at the University of Central Florida. He attended confirmation classes at Temple Emanu-El and shared these thoughts on what it means to be Jewish with his classmates and congregants as part of the Temple's confirmation service celebrating their achievement. Thanks, Leo, for sharing it with us now.
Why are you Jewish? It's a question that I have heard countless times, and I've always given generic answers, such as, because my parents are Jewish, or I don't know. Even though I've heard the question asked frequently, I'm still searching for the answer. And as a confirmand, it's time for me to ask myself that question. Why am I Jewish? Since my birth, Judaism has been a pillar of my life. I'm the son of 2 rabbis, and that's about as Jewish as it gets. I wouldn't be surprised if my first words were Baruch Atah Adonai. I attended a Jewish preschool and elementary school, and Temple Emanuel has always been a second home. My friends have been Jewish. My family is Jewish. I even had a dog named Mazel. Judaism has been so deeply integrated into my life that I've never really had to think about it. I never asked myself if I wanted to be Jewish simply because I couldn't comprehend living my life any other way. I don't think it was until I began to attend public school that I realized I was part of a minority. Few of my friends and teachers knew about Shabbat, and words like Passover were simply gibberish to them. I was taken aback by people's lack of knowledge. Trying to fit in, I found myself laughing off the occasional anti-Semitic joke, or I simply avoided the topic of religion. It was a bittersweet moment when I realized that being Jewish made me different. Maybe it wasn't easy at first, but today I wear my Judaism proudly. Living in a country where my religion is a minority, I realize now that Judaism is truly beautiful. Being outnumbered, we fellow Jews stick together. We are one big family. I feel personally connected to any Jewish person around the world. Our family is about 75% more likely to see a movie if there is a Jewish cast member. Each of us feels the joy when a fellow Jew succeeds, and we all feel the pain when a fellow Jew, even one we will never meet, fails. I know that if I am ever going through a hard time, I can look to my Jewish family for support. They have never failed me in the past. I am so grateful for all the love my temple has provided over the years. Everyone in this room means so much to me. You have been there to lift my spirits during sad times, and you've been equally present to celebrate the good times. Being a Jew has provided so much for me, but I guess it still doesn't answer the question. Why am I Jewish? I think the answer is this. I simply wouldn't be Leo Glickman without it.
Loretta Bauman will be reading her story, Finding a Connection with God. Loretta worked on Wall Street for over 17 years before moving to Sarasota in 1997. A mother, sister, and wife, she is always looking for ways to improve her connection with God and to grow spiritually and help others. A Temple Emanuel member for the past 2 years, she shared this story at the Shabbat service dedicated to healing last year. And we're so grateful to her as she continues to heal for sharing it with us again now.
I titled my story, Finding a Connection with God. I'm originally from Bensonhurst in Brooklyn, New York. As a child, I started elementary school at a yeshiva, and from there I went to public schools. My family practiced the traditions of the Jewish faith, the holidays, the food, the gatherings, but other than that, I did not follow any organized religion growing up. From the age of 17, I worked on Wall Street as a money broker. It was a fast-paced and decadent lifestyle, and it contributed to many challenges later on in my life. 2 years ago, I had to face one of the toughest challenges of my life. I was diagnosed with cancer. My feelings overwhelmed me. I felt like I was in a storm. I couldn't see or feel where I was going. Cancer and the prospect of dying consumed me. I had to trust in order to move forward. I had to find strength and patience. Ahead of me were tests, appointments, and lots of waiting. Nothing prepared me for being told that I had cancer. The word itself was scary. I was in a state of shock and disbelief, so distraught I didn't think I could cope. I think it's important at this point to mention I'm a recovering alcoholic. I hit bottom 12 years ago, drinking 24/7, not caring about much other than the next drink. All social activities and functions revolved around alcohol. I was given an ultimatum and I knew things had to change. It was sad. My life was all about drinking. It was not a pretty picture. When I look back at those days, I'm reminded how far I've come and how help was given to me so freely when I walked into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous. I had to learn a new way to live. A new chapter had begun, and I was determined to succeed no matter how difficult it was. I put myself into an outpatient program and began to heal one day at a time. The program itself was not just about how to stop drinking, it was about how to live. Alcoholics Anonymous offers a way of life with a fellowship that truly cares and wants to see you succeed. It's very similar to the support and caring we receive here at Temple Emanu-El. The more I go to meetings, the more I trust in a higher power. Upon receiving the cancer diagnosis, I knew I needed God in my life. Since coming to Temple, I now call my higher power God. My life now is about living with integrity and doing the right thing. It's about keeping my side of the street clean. It's about learning to forgive myself and others. I can walk around with my head held high. I can be of service to those still sick and suffering and show them how to live a clean and sober life and make a difference. My Alcoholics Anonymous support group started a prayer line when the group heard about my cancer diagnosis. The group was non-denominational. It consisted of my AA peeps, family, friends, and sometimes even strangers. Everyone around the world was praying for me, and I was sure it was making a difference. I felt if I could turn to God, I'd get the answers I needed or the peace that I needed to live. It was a push that showed me the way to Temple. Moffat and my oncologist in Sarasota put me on a broad spectrum chemo as they were unable to identify the hundreds of tumors that had invaded my bowels. So chemo began. I lost my hair. There were plenty of side effects. I underwent transfusions constantly. Nothing was working. I was told I should make sure my affairs were in order, when suddenly a renowned pathologist in Miami identified the cancer in my bowels as lung cancer cells. I was informed that my cells were a candidate for immunotherapy. At this point, my diagnosis was stage 4 lung cancer, and I was put on pureed food for months. After starting immunotherapy, I went for my first PET scan in December of 2018. It was a miracle. There was not a single tumor in my bowels, not one, and there was shrinkage in my lungs. As I mentioned, the fellowship and program of Alcoholics Anonymous were paramount in steering me to Temple. I had been attending meetings regularly for close to 10 years when I received the cancer diagnosis. Thankfully, I had enough time under my belt, so I knew enough to not drink, go to meetings, and ask for help. My partner of over 18 years knew that we needed family, friends, and my AA people to get through the cancer, which affected everyone around me just as the alcohol had done. But I knew something was missing. I needed something more to enable me to feel peace and comfort during this turbulent time. So I asked one of the members of my group, what temple would they go to? Without any hesitation, they said Temple Emanuel. I was seeking a connection with God when my partner and I walked through the temple's doors. It was the first time I had been in Temple in over 40 years. All I did was cry. We were greeted by Rabbi Sheffrin. I asked him to pray for me. That evening at services, he said a Mishabera for me, and I've been coming to Temple ever since. Being involved with the Temple has expanded my social network. It's given me closer community ties and more life satisfaction. And today, when I think of God, my anxiety is soothed. I could shift my focus away from my diseases and focus on community and helping others. There's a shared sense of joy, and finding faith has helped me find comfort in knowing there is a plan and a purpose in my life journey. My faith and spirituality grow daily since walking through Temple Emanuel's doors. I make a genuine effort to listen. Faith guides my decisions. Faith gives me strength to move through the most difficult situations, no matter the difficulty. Faith empowers me to know God is by my side. Practice Judaism offers value and balance in my life. I'm offered peace and harmony. Cancer is not a blessing, I know, but God has used this experience to bring blessings into my life, which I didn't realize were there before. I'm not fond of saying everything happens for a reason, but becoming sober and knowing enough to walk through the doors of Temple Emanuel has shown me there is a plan and a lesson to be learned as I go through these challenges. Prior to coming back to Temple, I could not fully have a connection, relationship, or understanding with God, but I felt God's presence when I walked into Temple, and I now rely on God's love, grace, and power. I'm eager to learn and study Jewish beliefs and traditions. I have found contentment in my life exactly where it is. I have a loving partner, I have happiness, and I enjoy whatever I'm doing. My cancer journey is far from over. There are no safe levels, which is the same with my sobriety. I have to be diligent in going to meetings to keep my sobriety strong. It's a priority along with going to temple. There are still masses in my lung. Immunotherapy stopped working and I'm back on chemo. They have shrunk since my last test and treatment continues for me. Recently, a brain MRI, they had found brain lesions which were treated with radiation. The last MRI showed nothing new, so that's a good thing. So as I write these words, I'm a work in progress. Scans, MRIs, blood work are my new norm, yet each day is a gift. I want to let others know that it's important to reach out and ask for help. I've learned that God, fellowship, temple, and community help us navigate our way through horrible diseases and challenges. And I've learned too that there are no dark days when you lean on your faith and those who love you.
Eleanor Wachs will be reading her story, My Hanukkah Miracle. Eleanor is a folklorist with a PhD from Indiana University. Currently the president of the Florida Folklore Society, she has written and published articles about crime victim stories in New York City, urban legends, and personal experience narratives. She lives in Sarasota. Thank you, Eleanor, for sharing your story with us.
Hello, my name is Dr. Eleanor Wachs, and I wish you all a Happy New Year. I've been a member of Temple Emanuel for 12 years, and I'm very happy that I found this temple. Bruce Black, who runs the Jewish Writing Project, asked me to read my story, My Hanukkah Miracle, which I will now. I would say that I was the only child in Borough Park, Brooklyn, who begged for a menorah. When I was growing up, there was very little Jewish life in our apartment at 1466 49th Street. Yes, there were a few Yiddish words thrown in here and there, and a few Jewish foods picked up at the bakery and the delicatessen, or takeout, kosher takeout that we would eat at home. But there was no mezuzah on the doorpost, no brown and white Hadassah Hospital sticker annually placed on the apartment door. There were no Shabbos candlesticks. There was no Seder plate. There was no Jewish calendar in Hebrew and English for Benchlich times. No blue tin tzedakah box for the poor that rattled noisily when coins were dropped in. There were no ritual objects in our home on display. Yet I was surrounded by the signs of a continuing Jewish tradition. At a friend's house, I learned when to use the soap with the blue stripe and when to use the soap with the red stripe when washing dishes. On Yom Kippur, I saw that it was expected to get dressed up, but allowable to wear sneakers. It was much later, way past childhood, that I found out what a shotness test was. I could not figure out why a dry cleaner could perform what I thought was a medical test. Brooklyn's neighborhood of Borough Park, where I grew up on 49th Street, was a Jewish world on display, noisy and busy, except for the Sabbath day, when it was peaceful and quiet. On Shabbos, everyone walked, men in long black caftans flapping in the breeze like penguins' wings, and huge fur-trimmed streimels, hats, wide-brimmed hats that designated their Hasidic sect. They would walk with their small boys. Young girls, whether in the sweltering summer heat or the freezing winter, wore long sleeves and white tights, and would saunter across the sidewalk in groups of 5 or 6, connected by pinkies. 14th Avenue had a conservative temple with a choir, wooden pews, velvet and silver-encased Torahs, and a rabbi with a booming voice that reached the 1,000 ears of the worshipers each Friday night and Saturday morning. The other temple on 15th Avenue was Orthodox, with its beautiful Italianate dome that opened up to show the evening stars. 4 steebles, or house synagogues, were on 49th Street, where men, like rows of tall pepper shakers, rocked back and forth in prayer. Supposedly, There was a mikveh, a ritual bath, in the basement of an unobtrusive red brick house with forsythias and a decorative iron fence. The house was indistinguishable from the others on either side. How could there be a bath in the basement? What a mystery. On Friday afternoon, everyone scurried around a bit faster to get ready for Shabbos. Bouquets of pink and white mums dumped into white mop pails were sold on the 13th Avenue corner next to the newspaper stand, which had the Yiddish newspapers, the New York Post, the Daily News, and the New York Times. The silver candlesticks with the Shabbos candles were in windows by now. The crystal chandeliers in the front rooms on 49th Street were soon to glow for at least a full day. I would see the large dining table with a lace cloth. The next day, the table would be filled with crystal bowls of fruit and kosher candies. Sometimes I would see the portrait of the Rebbe hung at the center wall behind the dining room table, but I never knew who he really was, or his name, or his importance. 2 enormous rosy pink apartment buildings stood tall near the end of our block. We lived in apartment 4C. It was a cramped, 1-bedroom apartment for 4 people. 1455, with its twin right across the street, was there to see. In the dismal and dark lobby of 1466, free of any furniture which had been stolen years before, I would wait for the Shabbos elevator that stopped on every floor, and while I was there, waiting for the elevator, I sniffed the sweet aroma of chicken soup that wafted through the first floor lobby, imagining the matzo balls in the steaming broth. Next course, I would guess, would be the chopped liver, a small delicious scoop sitting on a lettuce leaf, or perhaps an oblong of gefilte fish, dunked in jelly sauce and magenta horseradish, followed by a few more courses and a delicious Shabbos dessert. In this neighborhood, I wanted to celebrate Shabbos and all the Jewish holidays and their rituals. For Hanukkah, I wanted a menorah. The menorah I yearned for was a plastic chartreuse menorah with 2 lions at its base. It sat in the Barton Candy shop window on 13th Avenue for the whole month of December. The lions' heads were tilted back with their manes braided. They had a distinguished look for their important job, holding up the weight of the burning candles of every night of Hanukkah, the festival of lights. Across the top of the menorah was a metal strip with 9 candle holders, and underneath the strip was a Hebrew script, which of course I couldn't read. Surrounding the menorah were shiny gold coins of chocolate Hanukkah gelt, or pretend money that children used for barter when spinning the dreidels, or tops. I wanted this menorah in the same way that a young girl would want a pretty doll or a fluffy stuffed animal, 2 worthless dust gatherers, according to my mother. I didn't expect any gift for Hanukkah from my parents. However, I had to go to the annual Christmas party where my father worked and where Santa Claus, with his big sack, would pull out gifts for all the children. Christina, Camilla, John, Anne-Marie, Eleanor. Santa would usually give me some token. I remember a silver bracelet that soon had a greenish tinge. It was an annual ritual for my family to go to the army base where my father worked. My father would make the rounds, making sure he said hello to this general or that lieutenant, and my mother would stand by him, smiling. But the late afternoon affair, which was usually on a Friday, always filled me with a deep sadness. I knew that I wasn't going to celebrate either holiday. Santa wasn't going to visit 4C, and no menorah would glow there. I had nothing to say to the other children who would ask me about my Christmas plans. On my long walks on 13th Avenue to the public library on 43rd Street, my usual ruse to leave the apartment, I would linger at the Barton's candy shop window, checking to see if the menorah was still there. It never dawned on me that the shop would have more than one. Maybe I was attracted to its unusual color, or its prominent place in the window, or its chocolate surroundings. Unlike the many stores on the avenue filled with very expensive Judaica, this was a simple menorah. My mother bought candy weekly in Barton's or Lofts, their competitor, to feed her chocolate addiction, or you could say raise her serotonin levels with sugar to escape an unhappy marriage. All varieties of chocolate, from fancy truffles to the plain Hershey bars, was staple in our home, like crackers or green beans or fruit at friends' home. One chilly night, we were walking home side by side from the library, both of us holding the treasures we had found on the library shelves. When we passed Barton's, my mother stopped. "Let's go in there for a moment," she said, as if it was an unusual stop. She marched ahead, opening the heavy glass door with its long designer handle, as I followed behind, giving a quick peek in the window for the chartreuse menorah. "Yes, a box of Butter Crunch, a box of mixed dark chocolate, and a half pound of orange peel, and 2 chocolate marshmallow squares," were my mother's orders to the candy lady, who scrambled up and down the counter from case to case as my mother pointed out what she wanted to buy. My mother took out her wallet from her purse to get the money to pay for the chocolate. I stood next to her, anxiously gathering up the chutzpah to ask for the menorah, expecting to hear the familiar annoyance in her voice because of my request. I knew I was going to displease her, and I knew of her quickness to anger would rise in seconds and could last for days and shut me out. Ma, did she hear me? Was she too involved in figuring out if she had enough cash to buy her chocolates? "What is it, Eleanor?" "Ma, can I get the green menorah in the window?" Everything stopped. I held my breath, waiting for her answer. The cash, which was soon to be extended to the candy lady, was snatched back into the second button of her coat. The candy lady stopped the transaction. She leaned back against the counter, crossed her arms across her white uniform, and stared at us, waiting for the outcome. Was this sale finished or not? "Why would you want that? We don't need it." "Oh, please, I will take care of it." Here was the paradox. Denying a Jewish child in Borough Park was like refusing a Christmas tree to a Catholic kid in Italian Bensonhurst. "Please, Ma, I'll do all the lighting." "Well, all right. Does it come with any chocolate?" The candy lady went to the window and pulled out the menorah and put it in a special box for it, which she stored in a shelf behind the counter closer to the front window. Then she put it in a Barton's plastic bag and stretched over the counter and handed it to me. My mother paid for her candy, my menorah, and the Hanukkah gelt, and we schlepped home on the icy cold city streets with her plastic bags of candy, my menorah, and our library books. I must have bought a blue box of Hanukkah candles somewhere on the avenue, since they were everywhere, and they were so inexpensive. On the back of the box, the prayer for lighting the candles was transliterated, and I mumbled it each night, even though there wasn't anyone around to correct me if I made a mistake in Hebrew. After all, who would know? Even then, I knew we were different, yet Jewish. It was both a confusing time and a shameful time. I was unlike many of the girls in our Jewish neighborhood who had kosher homes and attended Hebrew school, something that I envied. But now I had my plastic menorah, and I could enact the ritual that I saw around me in my community. The candy shops are gone now, and my mother died years ago, yet I still have my candy shop menorah. It's my Hanukkah miracle. Lashana Tova. Thank you.
Albert Ernst will be reading his story, My Father and His Tefillin. Albert first shared the story at Yom HaShoah services held at Temple Emanuel 3 years ago, and is kind enough to read it for us today, a day when we all offer prayers to remember and to be remembered. Thanks, Al, for sharing the story again with us.
My Father and His Tefillin. My father, Yitzhak Estreicher, was born in 1913, the eldest of 12 children of a very wealthy Orthodox Jewish family in Sosnowiec, Poland, a then thriving city on the Polish-German border. As the eldest Estreicher child, my father assumed the role of Talmud scholar. He literally knew the entire Torah by heart. My father really led 3 lives: a glorious pre-Hitler life, a horrific Hitler life, and a kind of a lost soul post-Hitler life, even in America, a country he loved. I was part of his post-Hitler life. In December 1939, on the cusp of his transition from pre-Hitler to life with Hitler, my father married Itka Kartush, and together they had a son, Simcha Estreicher. As the Nazis started their cleansing of Jews, my father, his wife Itka, and son Simcha hid in an attic until 1943. My father would periodically venture out for necessities. On one such night, he and his sister buried a number of items, including religious items and a wealth of family diamonds. One of the items buried was his set of tefillin. In late 1943, the Nazis found my father and his family. In December 1943, my father's wife Itka and his son Simcha were directed to the wrong line by the Nazis, and they both perished. According to records that I received as recently as a couple of years ago from the Holocaust Survivor and Victims Resource Center in Washington, D.C., which is part of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, my father was sent to Shredula in May 1943 and transferred to Birkenau in December 1943. Nearly 2 years later, in February 1945, he was transferred to Dera, and in March 1945, my father was transferred to Bergen-Belsen, where I was born, luckily, after the war, when Bergen-Belsen became a displaced persons camp. Through a marriage arranged by the International Jewish Committee, my father wed my mother in 1946. I was born in March 1949, and on September 29, 1949, my parents and I sailed to America on the SS General Baloo, 2 survivors with their 5-month-old son on a long cruise. My parents advised me that I was sick the entire voyage. They didn't speak English, they had no funds, they had no occupation to speak of. The Jewish Federation in New York took care of them. Just prior to setting sail for America, my father returned to the area where he and his sister had buried the wealth of diamonds and other items, including the tefillin, which I have with me today. His sister beat him to the diamonds. They were gone, but the tefillin were still there. My father loved his children, my sister and me, with a passion, but he was really a round peg in a square hole in this country. He eventually became a house painter, but he was a troubled 4-foot 10-inch Balkore Torah reader, a survivor with a heavy accent who had trouble fitting in. Every night he had nightmares, and I distinctly remember him screaming night after night, Zibitson, Neinsen, eine 40, 1941, the tattooed number on his arm. When a police officer would stop him for speeding or for going through a stop sign, he would imagine it was a German SS officer, and he would run. They caught him, of course, and they'd handcuff him, of course, and that didn't help. He was hardly a little league coach or a country club kind of father, but he loved us with a fierce passion. He lived until December 1996. In his life, He lost 2 wives, a son, and probably his parents and 9 brothers and sisters. I say probably because most survivors aren't sure their families perished. They just don't know. I still remember my parents staring at any newsreel, hoping to see a lost family member who made it to Israel or Argentina or anywhere. In 1978, my dad wrote a letter to his family to be opened and read on his death. That letter, opened on his death in 1996, will be shared in another day. Obviously, the letter is an emotional matter for me, but the themes will be important to all of us. He urged us to live a spiritual life, to support Israel, and to honor our mother. He asked us to remember to say Kaddish and to be charitable. That was my dad, and these were his tefillin. Thank you.
Charlotte Gold will be reading her story, Ernestine's Fudge Ministry. Charlotte is the author of the Jewish-themed books for children, The Potter's 4 Sons, A Fable, and The Answered Prayer and Other Yemenite Folktales. She writes books for children, stories and articles for adults. She lives in Sarasota and has been a member of Temple Emanuel for more than 15 years. Thank you, Charlotte, for sharing your story with us.
And I'm going to tell you a story, a true story, that may make you laugh, and I hope it makes you think. Sometimes a kid, not necessarily the best looking or the smartest, stays in your mind long after you leave school. For me, that kid was nose in the book, Bible reading Ernestine Rogers. She didn't call attention to herself, but if there was a riff and all the horsing around before our 8th grade math class started, you could hear the soft turn of a page, or even while the teacher was explaining a problem. The first time that happened, Mrs. Adams didn't appear to notice. She was at the chalkboard, her back to the class, until somebody tattled, "Mrs. Adams, Ernestine's not paying attention." The teacher turned around, holding the chalk like a baton, and I felt sorry for Ernestine. She'd only been in class for a week. Still, she should have known better. But instead of scolding her, the teacher fixed the rest of us with an angry glare. "People, my job is teaching and yours is learning. Do you have to write 100 times to make it stick in your brains?" "No, ma'am," we mumbled. And after that, we pretty much ignored Ernestine. When she read her Bible, we just kept quiet, and most of us pretended not to notice. I noticed, though, because Ernestine was a wonder to me. Imagine a mousy little thing like that standing up to the teacher. Began to bug me, wondering how she did it. So one noontime, I passed up having lunch with my friends and went to the table near the back wall where Ernestine always sat. I slid onto the bench across from her. "Hi, Ernestine." She'd been reading, and now she looked up, keeping her place with a finger. She smiled, a surprised, happy smile. "Do you want to eat with me?" I guess so." I didn't expect to feel so uncomfortable. "It's nice back here," I managed to say. "It's lonely, though." She smiled again, but not today. She wasn't making it any easier, acting like we were good friends. Finally, I just said it. "Ernestine, I've been wondering, why do you always read the Bible? Plus, how do you get away with it?" "It's just something I do," she said. "When you trust in the Lord, you try to follow what he says, which means learning the Holy Scriptures." She paused. "Let me ask you a question. How well do you know the Lord?" "About as well as I know math." "Why?" Instead of answering, she reached inside her lunch bag and brought out 2 neatly wrapped squares. "Homemade fudge," she said, pushing one towards me. "It's pretty good." Pretty good? It was great. Full of walnuts and not too sweet. I'd never tasted fudge like that, and I'd never met anyone like Ernestine. While I ate the fudge, she read the Bible to me, all about the eternal damnation lying in wait for people who don't seek salvation through Jesus Christ. I'm going to help you get saved, she said. And much, much later, I realized that Ernestine's ministry had begun with me. We had lunch together the next day, too, along with a little conversation, more fudge, and Bible reading. My two best friends got mad. They said I could eat with that girl my whole life and wouldn't let me walk with them to our next class, which Ernestine wasn't even in. I hadn't told them about the fudge, but it was really the high point of having lunch with Ernestine. It certainly made listening to the Bible easier. Although I'd gone to Sunday school, those biblical stories were totally new to me, and before long, they started interfering with my sleep. Whenever I closed my eyes, I'd see those poor, tormented people. I had to stay awake to keep them out of my dreams. But Ernestine didn't always read the Bible. Sometimes she'd just talk. She'd tell me about regular people who'd played into Satan's hands, like the doctor who was too busy saving lives to get himself saved, and the pilot who intended to get saved but died in a plane crash before he got around to it, and the kind, generous couple who believed that good deeds alone would get them into heaven. They're all in agony this very minute, Ernestine would assure me. I just pray that their lives are a warning to others. I didn't have to ask what others. She meant me. After one especially tragic story, I raced home, threw myself into my mother's arms, and burst into tears. The story of what I'd been going through for almost 2 weeks tumbled out, as did my overwhelming fear. Our family was going to hell. We have to get saved, I cried, half choking in my hurry to spur my mother into action. We have to do it right away before we die. You and Daddy are already old. My mother stroked my hair and held me close until I stopped crying. Now listen to me. There are many different beliefs about God and many different ways to interpret the Bible. We Jews believe in God, but not in the existence of hell or Satan. Are you sure we're not going to burn forever and ever, I asked. I'm sure, but if you talk to the rabbi, you'll understand more. He's better explaining than I am. Want me to call him? I already felt better. I trusted my mother. She didn't lie to me. She never said that medicine wasn't bitter when it was, or that a shot wasn't going to hurt when she knew it would. That's okay, Mama, I said. I was just so scared. She tilted my wet face so she could look into my eyes. Is there anything else? Yes, one thing. I took a deep breath. Ernestine says we have to pray to Jesus. My mother thought about this a while before she said, Jews pray to God, not to Jesus. Jews believe that Jesus was a wise teacher and a good, kind man, but a man like Abraham. I started to cry all over again, but what'll I do about Ernestine? I don't know that you have to do anything but be respectful of her beliefs. You can do that without accepting them for yourself, can't you? I said yes, kissed my mother, and went to wash my face. But I couldn't wash away what was really bothering me. It was the fudge. My conscience pointed out that I couldn't go on accepting Ernestine's fudge since I had no intention of accepting her salvation. But I'd be earning the fudge by listening, I argued. My conscience wouldn't give up. Is it a fair trade, knowing what you know, it asked me? I preferred not to answer, and in the end, my conscience was no match for the fudge. Ernestine and I went on having lunch together. I never told her what my mother said and made sure I was respectful as always. Still, something had changed, a subtle shift in our positions. I think she sensed that I was no longer frightened by her stories or in awe of her. The day she stopped bringing fudge, I knew it was over. I made up with my friends, and Ernestine went back to reading the Bible herself. She moved away after that year, and I lost track of her. But recently, a friend from junior high told me that Ernestine had become a preacher. She even had a church of her own. I hadn't thought of Ernestine for years, but I didn't have to dig deep for the memory of how I dropped her like a lead weight when the fudge ran out. Guilt has never lain much below the surface in my psyche. But hearing about her success sent a burst of relief through me, much like the time my mother allayed my fears of hell. All those years, I'd carried the secret fear that I'd ruined Ernestine's life. How silly it seemed now. How egotistical to imagine that she'd given up because her fudge ministry failed with me. Good for you, Ernestine, I felt like shouting. Good for you. And good for my mother, too, I thought. She could have discouraged our friendship, viewing it as a threat to my spiritual development. Instead, she took the occasion to teach me respect for others and for their beliefs. That lesson stuck, even though my passion for chocolate fudge faded. My heart and mind and waistline have never been sorry.
Thanks to all our writers who were kind enough to share their stories with us this afternoon. And thanks to all of you for listening. Listening is an act that may seem utterly passive, but it is actually quite active, especially when listening to stories, which require us to listen not only with our heads, but with our hearts too. When a writer puts words on paper, or a storyteller tells a story, he or she never knows how those words will be received, or if anyone is actually listening. In that way, writing a story is, as I mentioned earlier, like praying. Today, you helped each of these writers feel that his or her prayers were heard. And just as their words were gifts from their hearts to yours, your act of listening was a gift from your heart to theirs. Today, we hope and pray that God is listening too, and that the prayers of each of us reach heaven before the gates begin to close. May God answer our prayers, and may all of us be inscribed and sealed for a healthy and sweet year ahead. Thank you.